Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just broke down a little bit of the NFL draft, gave you some of my biggest takeaways, my favorite picks, some of the teams that won the day, some of the teams that did not win the day, and then some college football teams that really benefited over the weekend. But let's get to some spring games. There is tons going on still in the spring game calendar. We still have a couple of games coming down the road, although this was the last weekend that we had a ton of stuff going on. I totally forgot to preview these games on Friday, got really caught up in all the NFL draft talk, but let's break down a couple of the takeaways from these games, and let's start in Nebraska. And let's start with Dylan Raiola, because he was the guy that everyone was talking about coming into this game, and he was absolutely the guy that they were talking about coming out of this game. Went 16 for 22, 238 yards and 2 touchdowns. His team won the game 25-21. He had an absolutely beautiful ball to Jalen Lloyd for a 64-yard touchdown. It showed everything that this guy is capable of, and he looked absolutely insanely comfortable in the pocket, something that is not necessarily a given when a freshman quarterback is coming into the fray, but that dude looks absolutely comfortable navigating any situation. On that 64-yard ball, he had to step up into a pocket that was a little bit collapsing and found a way to make that pass get where it needed to go, and just a remarkable performance by that kid. And I think Nebraska fans have to be very pumped about that. You have your guy for the next number of years, at least 3 years. You have this guy likely as your starting quarterback, and it's not that the other guys in the room were not talented. Dalen Kalen, another guy that was an early enrollee, went 9 for 16 with 91 yards. The incumbent starter, Henrik Harburg, went 8 for 13 with 163 yards and 2 scores. So it's not that the cupboard is bare by any means, and you have to push Dylan Raiola into the spotlight, but he's absolutely earned that spotlight, and I think he's the guy that absolutely will be trotting out with the first team around this time in the fall, and I think he will be a huge quarterback for them. Now, he will have some growing pains, but it was obviously a fantastic day for Nebraska fans, and hopefully will be a fantastic fall for them with Dylan Raiola. But let's get to a couple of injuries that happened throughout the day. Demetrius Bell and Bly Hill, two guys. Wide receiver Demetrius Bell went down after he only had a catch and 7 yards, so was not in the game for very long. Went down, had to be carted off, was not a good situation. And then you had Bly Hill kind of in the same situation. Both are kind of undergoing testing. We'll figure out more about those injuries down the road, but it sounded like Matt Rule was not necessarily super optimistic. Now, a lot of things can change, and we don't really know what happens until those tests come through, so don't want to necessarily speak in uncertainties here by any means, but definitely not the greatest thing for a spring game. But that wide receiver group is more than talented, so it's not necessarily a super big worry. Malachi Coleman and Isaiah Garcia Constaneda, were out for the spring, so they're still recovering from injuries, did not play. Isaiah Nair, the transfer from Texas, definitely showed off his ability during this game. Jamal Banks, the transfer from Wake Forest, showed off his ability, and definitely is the guy that I would expect to be the wide receiver one for this group, a very talented kid that can do a number of different things. Running back looked really solid. Dante Dowdle, the Oregon transfer, was getting the majority of the carries, had 76 yards on 7 carries, a very, very talented kid, someone that can do a ton of really, really good things, was just kind of buried behind a number of really good running backs over there at Oregon, so finally getting his shot in the spotlight and taking full advantage right now. You also had Gabe Irving and Raheem Johnson from injury. All of those guys are going to be really, really talented. And then you got Emmett Johnson and Quinton Ives, all guys that can play a part for them. But Dante Dowdle is probably where it starts for that running game in the fall. Nebraska also had 2 turnovers in a 97-play scrimmage. Last year they had about 8. So it shows you the difference in taking care of the ball, making sure that everything is exactly where it needs to be, because as we know with Nebraska, some of the games that they have lost, they absolutely should not have lost. They lost it themselves. They did not get beat by any means. They gave it away in some circumstances. So that is going to be a huge thing for them, especially with a rookie quarterback. One of them was the pass hit receiver, and it just bounced off him into defender's hands. Now the ball was a little bit behind the receiver, but at the end of the day, some of that stuff will it kind of is up in the air, right? But not a ton to speak of from the defense. Not necessarily to say that they had a really bad day, although wasn't necessarily great. I do think that it'll be a fine group. It just is not the strength of that team right now, for sure. But let's move on over to Oregon. Let's talk about the Oregon Ducks. That quarterback room is outright unfair. We were talking about last week when Jaden Rashada signed with Georgia. That might be the best quarterback room in the country. Well, Oregon heard that, and they decided to put on an absolute show. And it wasn't just Dylan Gabriel and Dante Moore, who were fantastic. Dylan Gabriel completed 2/3 of his passes, 163, 2 touchdowns. Dante Moore went 11 for 16, 87 yards, had a 60-yard touchdown that was wiped off the board. So plenty of talent on that front two lines. But then you had Austin Novosad, who had a very, very good game. Someone that Oregon fans saw a little bit of last year. Didn't necessarily play quite as well as you would have hoped, but was a freshman, is getting back into the groove of things, and looks a lot better. Went 12 for 22, 177 yards, and was definitely very, very talented. Had the most yards of any quarterback on the roster during this game. And then Luke Moaga had a couple of plays. He's an incoming freshman. Had a couple of plays that made Oregon Twitter very, very excited about this kid. Definitely gave off some Marcus Mariota vibes during this game, but a very, very talented group that goes about 4 deep at this point. So I don't think Oregon fans have to worry about quarterback for quite some time, to be totally honest, up in Eugene. The running back room looked really solid as well. They had a ton of guys that showed out. Jordan James is obviously going to be the number one back there, but they have tons of other guys that have made a big time effect throughout the early parts of this spring camp and into the summer and into fall. But I think they have plenty of guys at that room. They have plenty of guys that can make tons of big-time plays, and whether it's running the ball or receiving. So this room should be more than fine, if we're being totally honest. I think Jaden Harris, I believe is his first name. I left off his first name here, but he was the player of the game in a lot of people's eyes and will likely be the backup running back this upcoming year. Definitely adds some different parts to that offense, so very excited for this running back room. I think a group that losing someone like Bucky Irving is not ideal, but they replaced him just fine with the group that they have, and I think they'll be able to run the ball just fine this upcoming year. The D-line was a huge question mark going into spring and kind of throughout spring, but they looked dominant. They looked like they absolutely dominated the offensive line throughout most of the day. A ton of really good plays. Ben Roberts was the one that made a huge impact in particular. Had 2 tackles and a sack. Was definitely a huge part of that defensive front, kind of winning the day. Had 5 total sacks throughout the day, although some of those probably could have been more, but it was a non-contact day for the QBs, obviously. So although it was non-contact for the QBs, was not for everyone else. So definitely left with some injuries and some rather big ones. You had Kobe Savage go down after a tough hit to Jordan James. You had Dante Manning walk to the locker room after an injury. You had Trayshawn Holden go out with an injury. So tons of guys that you absolutely need on the field that did not have the Saturday they had planned. Jerrion Dickey, another one that is coming in and has a huge amount of hype coming into this season. But at the end of the day, hopefully all those guys can get healthy. Plenty of time for them to do that, but not what you want to see by any means if you're Oregon. But hopefully, that doesn't become a problem into fall, but those are some tough injuries to watch for sure. But finally, let's get to primetime and the Buffs. Let's talk about Colorado. Weather did not necessarily cooperate for Dion and the Buffs. They definitely had to deal with some rain throughout this game. But Shedeur had a really solid day. Despite the rain, he went 10 for 14, 166 yards, and a touchdown. It felt like a guy that he was going to consistently throughout this game was LaJohntay Wester, the transfer from FAU, a very talented kid. I expect him to be their number one wide receiver this upcoming year, even with guys like Jimmy Horn Jr. and Omarion Miller and Travis Hunter. All of those guys are going to be incredible. I think LaJohntay Wester is going to be the best of them, and I think they absolutely need him to be the best, just because when you have Travis Hunter playing both sides of the ball, where corner is likely where he's going to be spending most of his time at the next level, they'll probably push him a little bit further in that direction this year. Omarion Miller is a great player, but probably needs a little bit more time to come on. Jimmy Horn Jr. makes plays kind of sporadically, but is a really good player that can help fill the gaps. But you need that clear wide receiver one that is only playing wide receiver, that, doesn't have to play both sides of the ball like Travis Hunter does. And I think LeJounte Wester is an absolutely great pickup for that. Running back room was a weird group to watch, to be totally honest with you. They had 3 running backs leave in the portal. Added in a couple of guys. Dallin Hayden from Ohio State is coming in, as is Rashad Amos from Miami of Ohio, who we'll talk about in the next segment. But at the end of the day, they did have to start a freshman cornerback, Isaiah Harge, at running back for this game. So not the situation that you want if you're a Colorado fan, but bringing in those 2 guys from the portal should be huge. And as long as those guys can become who they're capable of being, then this run game should be okay. It just did not look what it's going to look like in the fall on Saturday. But the O-line is definitely the one that everyone was watching, and it looks like the haul that Dion brought in seems to be working out pretty okay. They had Jordan Seaton starting, that remarkably talented freshman, had Tyler Brown, I'll do my best. Hank Zelinskas, Jeremy Mayers, and Khalil Benson, all very new guys to this program, and definitely will have to play a huge part in them going forward. They did not allow many pressures throughout the game, so only allowed 1 sack. Definitely a very, very encouraging performance. Maybe it has more to do with the D-line, I don't know, but definitely an encouraging performance after the offensive line was just downright terrible a year ago. So definitely a lot of moving parts there, but hopefully they can put together a good 5 and keep Shadur upright, because as long as you can do that, he is pretty remarkable, I'll be honest. Again, not a ton to talk about with the defense in this one. They're still kind of fighting an uphill battle there, still tons to bring in. They brought in a couple of guys through the portal over the last couple of days that will definitely help out, but definitely need some more reinforcements there. Then finally, another headline that came out was Dion saying that he is going to be in Boulder for quite some time, saying he will not be following his kids to the NFL, and I do believe he will not follow Shadur to the NFL, but I'm not necessarily sure if I believe him about this, to be totally honest with you. I think coaches, obviously that's what you're going to say, you're fully committed to that program, but when the right offer comes along, it's hard to pass that up. But we'll see what happens there. Maybe he's fully committed, and if he is, Colorado is in for a very, very interesting next decade or so if he's really, really committed to this program. So it'll be really interesting to watch all of that unfold. But spring games are always a very interesting thing, kind of a zero-sum game. But I believe Washington still has one to come. Wisconsin is another one, I believe, still has one to come. So possibly another one of these segments coming up. But definitely winding down on spring practice and getting into that summer kind of lull that we get into, but plenty of content still coming down the pipe, so don't worry about that. But we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about the transfer portal. There have been tons of stuff going on. We have tons of commits to break down, including one of the biggest guys in the portal committing, and then we have some intel that we want to break down, particularly around the defensive tackle position. So we will break all that down right after this, so stick with us.